As always, welcome to the home of sound science. And today we have a great conversation on all things inflammation, so insulin, glucose, and indeed a measurement called ESR. And there's a new technology in a few months, hopefully, that will be able to conveniently measure this at home. And the links are down below. There's no sales here, but the links are down below to simply sign up to the mailing list to get some notification when the technology actually launches into the market. So I think that's a great idea. But in any case, let's get straight into the conversation with Bob Messerschmidt. Here we go. So we're going to do a kind of a short one today. I've met a very interesting guy introduced by friends who has a new technology on tracking inflammation, which obviously is a massive issue. As you'll know if you're in metabolicduo.com, inflammation is the root of most of the modern chronic diseases. But this guy, Bob Messerschmidt, has actually in the past cold emailed Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs replied, met with him, and then bought out his company. And a couple other startups too. So great to see you, Bob, and maybe you'll extend that introduction a little.
Thank you, Ivor. It's a pleasure to be to meet you and to be on your show. Yeah, that's exactly right. People talk about whether cold emails can be successful or not, but mine was. I had a technology company that I had started prior to this company. I started in 2008, and for various reasons, I thought Steve Jobs would be interested in what I was doing, and I didn't know him, and so I guessed his email. I wrote him an email and I guessed the email address. And it would have ended there because I guessed wrong. But I got an email back from a guy named Steve at apple.com. And he said, I'm probably not the Steve you're looking for. And that's all it said. And so then I tried again with S Jobs at apple.com. And that time it worked. And about a week later, I got an email in my box, and it said, "Can I call you somewhere?" And of course, I typed back in my phone number, and it instantly rang, and I was talking to Steve Jobs. So the rest is history. He was, in fact, interested in the technology. It was right at the time when the iPhone had been introduced about a year earlier, and iOS 3 was coming to the market, and that was the first version of iOS that had an app store. And Steve was in SJ, as we called him, was in a mode of looking for small acquisitions and so forth. I wasn't looking to be acquired. I was looking for investment in my company. I was too dumb at the time, still am, but I was too dumb at the time to know that Apple doesn't really invest. So it came to pass that Steve said, well, the only way that this makes sense for us is for Apple to own it. Yeah. And of course was open to that. And that happened. And I became an Apple platform architect. And the project that they acquired for me was very interesting. But I think what became even more interesting for me at Apple was my opportunity to then get read in on a different project, which was the Apple Watch, and became the Apple Watch. It was just a product idea at the time. And I was asked, just because of my background, I didn't talk about my background, but I'm an optics and spectroscopy guy by training and experience. Before that, I was a biochemist, so that actually ties in as well. But optics and spectroscopy, I became somewhat of a sector expert at Apple, and the people on the Apple Watch team reached out to me and asked me to architect a whole series of sensors that could possibly go in a watch form factor that could be used for digital health purposes. So all of these sensors on the back of the Apple Watch got, first light, as we spectroscopists say. First light was in my laboratory with a small team, and we saw, that one by one they've been added to the watch. It started out with the photoplethysmograph, which is, of course, measuring blood pulses just to measure your heart rate. And then I think the second one that got added, which was we also architected, my team also architected, was EKG. And the third one that's in there now is a thermometer, a temperature sensor. And that's pretty rote standard across the industry now, but it was pretty early days back in that time, so it was quite exciting.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's was a huge product. I never actually got one or tried one, but it was renowned pretty much. So you were in charge of the spectroscopy kind of team delivering that part of the architecture for the Apple Watch.
Yeah. I mean, not on a product team. So at Apple, you have these early ideation teams. It's a little bit, people are more familiar with that construct at Google that they call Google X. But there are at Apple all sorts of ideation teams around the company that tend to be little tiger teams of, led by one individual and several other individuals in the team, just kind of coming up with ideas and getting proofs of concept. So if it goes, if it survives, the gauntlet, then it goes eventually to a product team.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so that's kind of the engine behind the ideas, and viable ones are proven potentially viable, and then take it away, product team.
Exactly.
Familiar, yeah. So, well, let's get on to the actual real meat of the matter. So you've a new venture, and you're zoning in on ESR, which people mightn't be too aware of. It's not a new test, but the idea of conveniently being able to do it yourself, to keep an eye and track over time your inflammation levels and your autoimmune activity, etc., that's pretty new, I think.
It is. One of the benefits of being an obsessive sort of, Silicon Valley type, as a lot of us are, even if we're not in Silicon Valley, in digital health, is that, by really thinking about an idea deeply or a biomarker deeply, you can think about it differently. And so most people, I think, today are thinking about biomarkers really because of their clinical diagnostic application. And ESR is an important marker in clinical in clinical practice, although it's not really specifically diagnostic for anything. So it's not like you do a blood test and okay, you have cancer or something like that. It's not a diagnostic, but it is an excellent indicator, or a screen especially, for chronic inflammation. And so I started thinking about, well, what do you really want in a biomarker that you're going to use for tracking? And are perhaps the characteristics of that biomarker somewhat different from what you want for diagnostics? And so that's what led me to really obsess about ESR, because I can measure it. It seems to me it's really important in tracking. If you're going to be doing frequent measurements, you have to make that user experience really as pleasant as possible, to get somebody to give a drug. If it's going to be based on blood, which I strongly believe, blood is the gold standard. So, there are eventually we'll be able to wave the tricorder at someone and, get all the information. But for now, you need a little bit of blood. For tracking, we wanted to make the user experience easy, and we wanted to make the per test cost low, low, less pain, so that people would do it frequently. And then you can create a tracking. And I can talk longer about ESR. It's short for the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. You're very familiar with it. And it's really just that. It's in a tube, in a glass tube or plastic tube held vertically. How rapidly do the red cells fall down, leaving clear plasma at the top? And that rate of falling is a complex process, but it's related to you can see a cartridge here with blood somewhat sedimented in it. It's a complex process that relates to the blood cells themselves becoming stickier, so they agglomerate, and that makes them heavier and they fall faster. That's a sign of inflammation. But also there's a component of what's going on in the plasma, where if the plasma fibrinogen level is high, and fibrinogen is another acute phase reactant that people measure for chronic inflammation. But if the fibrinogen level is high, the red cells also will fall more quickly. So It's complex, but it's come to be understood to be a very good marker and tracker of chronic inflammation.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right. The diagnostic versus the tracking kind of vector of what's going on under the hood is a distinction. I did notice when I had a quick look around, there's cardiac disease papers where it was 75% specific, which is pretty good for cardiac disease. But again, it's not about the specificity per se. It's about your kind of baseline and then where you go from there. And it reminds me a bit about like GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, that got me into this sphere. It's non-specific and the doctors tend to not be interested because it doesn't give a simple answer. But GGT in the actuaries' life expectancy charts blows away cholesterol. GGT is scary. And you can lower your alcohol, GGT goes down because liver damage. You can lower your diabetes, GGT goes down. You can even resolve a SIBO or bacterial overgrowth in the intestine that's inflammatory, and your GGT can go down. I know a guy with GGT highly elevated for 10 years. He discovered himself he had SIBO, resolved it, and for the first time in 10 years his GGT went down. So we're not here to talk about GGT, but ESR is a similar one, not so specific, but I did note as well in literature, it's uncanny or very powerful to predict outcome likelihood for cancers, depending on where it is, and autoimmune conditions, lots of stuff.
And there's an age dependency. So it's kind of a natural biological clock as well, which of course is in the zeitgeist these days. But here's a really interesting fact. So if you look at the medical literature or the standard of care for what your doctor is supposed to learn from your ESR reading, what it says is that females have a higher normal sedimentation rate than males. So there's a male-female differential. But then there's also this age progression. So as you get older, the normal range floats up. So you're allowed to have a higher ESR as you get older. But why, right? So it turns out that if you look at a healthy, so that's in a normal population, let's say all Americans, for example. The normal ranges are determined just by measuring a lot of people and saying what's the 95%, who's within the 95%, and that's considered normal. It really is as sort of rudimentary as that, and kind of unscientific when you come right down to it. But if you take a normal population, a healthy, I shouldn't say normal, I should say healthy, and even ultra healthy population of people, even if they're older, their ESR does not trend upwards.
Yes.
Oh. So I'm allowed, I've got a few years on me, I'm allowed to have an ESR of 30. And my doctor says I'm normal. But my ESR today is 3.
Yeah. And I love that because, my classic example, and I was stunned in 2012 when I discovered this, it was like they handed me a propaganda tool against them, if you will, the authorities. We knew and had loads of papers to indicate that fasting insulin should be around 5 or lower, ideally, 3 or 4, say, microunits per mil, IUs. And the Institute of Medicine range was still in 2012, I'm not sure what it is today, was 5 to 25 micro IU per mil. In other words, it was from kind of probably healthy up to 10 plus, which is diabetic, almost certainly, up to 25, which is heart attacks coming soon, son. And that's the normal range.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah, and like I say, it's calculated exactly the same way. It's just taking everybody and saying, okay, we're going to assume that 95% of these people are normal. And so that's going to be our normal range.
That's it. So if you go to Kitavans, that'll work pretty well. Ancestral people, indigenous lifestyles, no heart disease or inflammation really. And that would kind of work. A truly healthy, normal population. But they're doing it in America.
Yeah, that's right. And that's actually another thing. The normal ranges often are often white males. So there are indigenous populations and non-white male populations for which the normal range is actually completely wrong for a number of biomarkers, but that's probably a topic for another day.
True. No, but it's an interesting point as you tie it to, and it's like insulin resistance and insulin. Of course, with age, the range you should be at goes higher. They don't officially say this because they don't measure insulin really, but it would, because everyone's getting sicker, everyone's getting more inflamed, everyone's getting more insulin resistant. But you need to track that and say, I want to keep it when I was young and healthy. I mean, that's the target. And this device then, I hadn't heard of this before. Now, it's not available yet for a few months, and there's nothing being sold here, folks. But there is a waiting list to find out more when the technology emerges. But it essentially allows you to do regular tests at home with just your classic pinprick, which I think most people don't have a problem with anymore, really. Just a pin. It's just a tiny pinprick. It's not a lancet expecting like significant chunks of a milliliter.
If your listeners have done dried blood spot tests, that is a very heavy lancet to get enough blood for a dried blood spot. In fact, it might be more than one hanging drop even. So it might be drip, 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 or even up to 8 drops. So you need a fairly heavy lancet, which has kind of a blade. It's actually not even a needle. It's like a blade structure inside those to get enough for a dried blood spot. So I'm not sure those are really, I mean, they're not going to scale really to regular people too well. Okay. I mean, I think people who are using them are doing great things because we're getting a lot of early data, but I think the experience needs to be easier. And so we use a lancet that, they're dropping all over my desk, but they're the lightest ones you can buy, and they really don't hurt at all because we don't need that much blood, and we put it inside a really nice. There's the core logo there, nice capillary tube, and then that drops inside the reader device like so. You just feed it in here like that. And then it has to sit for a while because the blood has to sediment. And when you're done, it's just going to return to your dashboard your sedimentation rate for that sample. So you could do it. There's no reason with ESR to do it intraday. Glucose is one of those things where it's got diurnal variation, and so you do that intraday and even continuous, right? But with that's kind of the rarity. For most other biomarkers, your ESR is not going to change probably even much day to day as you go through various, finding out what's working for you. It's probably once a week. We think most people are going to test once a week or maybe even once every 2 weeks. And so the finger prick is kind of nothing, right? It's going to be super, super simple.
And funny enough, it just occurs to me, I actually prefer with the finger prick rather than the anticipation of the spring-loaded, which most people love. I actually prefer the little ones like, you put in a corkboard, a thumbtack. They come with some blood glucose meters, a little blue plastic, and you snap, and there's just a tiny pin, maybe 1/8 of an inch long. And I prefer to just dab it at my finger. That's my favorite method because then it's just nothing. You just dab it once or twice, you feel a tiny prick and squeeze, and there it is.
I got to say, I've not tried that, but they're super cheap, right? So you can just grab one and...
They're super cheap, and you know what it is? It's the same as not liking injections in the dentist for me and not really liking being on a plane. It's all about control. Any agency where I handed control, like the spring-loaded thing, I like to do it myself. So
I don't like to not drive myself. I always want to drive.
Yeah. So,
go ahead.
Oh no, that's super because ESR is time-honored, proven. It's not going to show up tiny fluctuations, like you say, but if you had an occult carcinoma or something, very likely because of the immune reaction, it could show that up. It'll show up if you're inflamed. It'll show up that your inflammation level is reducing. it'll give you a target to go after, which is a younger, healthy person's target that can be reached by healthy older people. But you'd need to be testing every week and applying yourself to what you're doing. Fasting, low carb, healthy, real food, no vegetable oils, all the stuff. Exercise, no doubt, will also enhance a lack of inflammation once you don't overdo it. So
absolutely.
Yeah, something to target.
I've become a huge believer in superfoods as a way to just from my own experience in measuring my ESR. There are certain foods that lower my ESR. So your first point is spot on. That almost everybody, and you don't have to be older. It can be even a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old. The ESR range is already sort of the normal range, right, is already trending up. So most people who come to this ESR measurement, there's going to be some headroom, which you can't say for a marker like HSCRP. There's not necessarily any headroom left for improvement because a lot of young, relatively healthy people are going to already be 0.8 or below 1 anyway, which So ESR, because of this age dependence phenomenon, there's going to be headroom, and there are going to be superfoods and supplements also. But I don't tend to be too much on the supplement bandwagon, but I know a lot of people are. I like foods that right now my obsession is tart cherry juice. Huge impact on my ESR. Brings it. So the last time, it was already low at something like 7, and it took it down to 3.
Interesting, because I always just think mechanistically when a proposal's thrown out. So what we're looking at there is the superfood, whether it's organ meats or tart cherries or whatever. Everyone's physiology is different, how they react is different, so you'd have to discover. But if you thin your, like aged garlic, say, you have a blood thinning effect, lower fibrinogen, that could be a mechanism. And also, if something, for whatever mechanism, appeals to your immune system or suppresses an immune overreaction, there's lots of potential mechanisms, but you'd have to kind of discover them yourself, I guess.
Yes, that's right. Well, and then there's genetics, right? My brother actually, my brother's a heart surgeon, but he has a condition called PMR, polymyalgia rheumatica. And so I don't know whether I'm predisposed to that also. Before I started all of my lifestyle interventions, my ESR was 40. Which is actually, so it's diagnostic. ESR is diagnostic for a very small, list of things, but PMR is one of those. My brother is diagnosed with it. It's just it's an autoimmune thing. So, these days, autoimmune things are everywhere, gut things, there's reason to be concerned about inflammation. I'm not the only one shouting about this. Everybody is pretty well convinced that inflammation is really the root of chronic disease. And so it's an exciting time to be in the inflammation space.
Yeah, and there's kind of a nuance there, or a kind of a gotcha, that the inflammation is the body's reaction to an insult. So I guess the root cause of the problem is still the insult, but the inflammatory milieu that is overextended and chronologically elevated in response to a problem, that is a huge part of the disease. And it's also a great marker. All the markers, HPPLA2 and CRP, and just all these markers of inflammation are great ways to track your kind of path. And
absolutely.
So
when you
we
think
might
mechanistically,
finish,
like you're saying, yes.
Yeah, no, I like it. And I will tell a little, just a brief anecdote. I first found out about ESR in, I think, Vail, Colorado, at a low-carb conference. And I was talking to a good friend of mine, Dr. Michael Eads, brilliant brain, so well researched. He wrote Protein Power and sold millions of copies years ago. But we're chatting about blood tests, and I'd gone into ApoB and LP and, LPPLA2, and I was deep in all the stuff, and he was familiar with all that too. But he said to me, just as a thought, he said, there's a blood test that's been around a long time, and doctors just don't really care about it anymore because all the newfangled ones are out, all the shiny tools are here. But he said, I found there were many occasions where it pulled up a significant issue with a patient where no other blood marker was showing up, but they had a slightly high ESR. And because of the way I am, I wasn't happy with that because I knew what it meant. And it would turn out to be an undiagnosed cancer, or it would turn out to be an autoimmune issue. Nearly always it was resolvable or addressable. So that was Mike Eads brought up ESR to me, and it always stuck in my head until recently when I found out about you. And
yeah. Well, I've talked to there are other enlightened physicians like Dr. Eads sounds like he is. I have a good colleague friend at Stanford named Dr. Tom Quartermas. And he stepped down as co-chief, but he was co-chief of cardiovascular medicine at Stanford. He really also likes ESR and says that the rise of CRP, he says CRP had a better marketing agent.
It's like, you know what, Bob, I have to say, I've gone deep into cholesterol. I've done countless lectures and animations, and I think I've really helped people understand, to be honest, over 10 years. But LP(a), I looked it up and I went deep. And LP(a), in indigenous populations eating indigenous food with indigenous lifestyles, you can go to multiple genetic different types of humans who fit that description, who have very low disease. And for them, LP(a) does not predict heart attacks at all. In fact, in one study, all they found was that it predicted better cognition in later life and when you're aged, higher LP(a). That was it. They couldn't get any correlation. But in the West, of course, because we're all diseased with insulin resistance, LP(a), because it relates to clotting mechanisms, does act as a correlate. But it's not the LP(a). So yeah, there's all these tests that the industry likes, and they might link to a drug, and off you go.
But, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So or they got a better reimbursement code.
Exactly. And let's be honest, everyone or most people watching this channel know, look, there's no conspiracy theories. It's a business. It's a mega business. Pharma has a revolving door with the FDA. All of the pigs are at the trough. It's just capitalism, crony gone wild. So that's just the way it is. So we need to be smart and we need to work things out ourselves. By perforce, we must, because we can't depend on the docs anymore.
And that was really, I guess I've always had that sort of personality, but that was Steve Jobs' philosophy too, that once you have so much computing power and so much screen real estate in your hand, and so much access to information, you can take control of a lot of these processes that you previously had to cede to experts. Nothing wrong with experts, but you're getting the sort of the average, recommendation from population averages. And so taking control and taking these things into your own hands in a responsible way, obviously, you want to make sure you're getting good data. But if you do, it's still the future. I think we're just early days in this way of thinking.
Yeah. No, excellently stated, Bob, I'll have to say. And we might wrap up, because I know we need to keep this a little on the short side, but maybe wrap up just with a quick review again of the technology. You have kind of mentioned it, the expected timings, and then, of course, the key, where people go to just to sign up for a waiting list to get more information. Again, there's no sell here, but I'll put it in the description box below as well.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity. So we are filling a waiting list right now. We have initial units in hand. As I held up, we are running lots of blood samples. You can see all my cartridges here. It's going through rigorous testing right now. We expect to be shipping in December. The first units from the waiting list, we expect to ship in December of this year still. And you can go to corehealth.com. That's COR, core without an E. So it's corhealth.com. And you can click on a link and add your name to our waiting list. Yeah, so it's a relatively simple instrument. So we're going to be able to sell it at, consumers, in order to I'm interested in helping as many people as possible. And so I want as many people as possible to be able to afford this. We're going to sell it under $200 for the reader device. So it's simple enough that we can, still stay in business at that price. And the tests we're still arguing a bit about, but they're going to be under $20 to buy a test. So that should be well within reach. Yeah, like I say, you can join a waiting list now, and I'd love it if your viewers would go there and have a look.
Yeah, that's great, Bob. And again, no sell, but you can look at it as it comes out, as it's FDA approved, and as all the data comes in, and then think about it some more. Just a thought, yeah, people have gotten kind of familiar because the glucose strips, I'm a high volume manufacturing guy, so I'm kind of familiar. Glucose strips obviously cost next to nothing to make, so they're just $1 or $2. But then when you've got a vial, and for the spectroscopy to look in, and I guess that's on the higher end, but then
it'll scale. It'll scale, but that's kind of where it has to be initially. But it will scale down as we build more.
Yeah, get them straight from Shenzhen on the slow boat from China in meter cubed packs, so they'll scale down.
Absolutely.
Great stuff, Bob. Well, delighted to meet you and have that chat. And I'll put the link on the screen actually for the last few minutes here and down below. We'll come back closer to the time when your brainchild, not blessed directly by Steve Jobs, because sadly he passed before this came to fruition, but nonetheless.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, please reach out to me in the comments. I'd love to hear from everyone. And thank you, Ivor. Very, very nice chatting.
Great stuff. Bob Messerschmidt. We'll see you next time. Bye, folks.
Thank you.
So there you have it, folks. Very interesting technology, I think, and hopefully it'll go according to plan. So as mentioned, the links are down below. It's just to sign up for a mailing list, and then when the technology is actually launching and FDA approved, you'll just get a heads up on where it's at or what the final kind of arrangement is. So very interesting stuff, and best of luck till next time.